We're here at Antigua Forum with David Seymour. And David, you're a parliamentarian in New Zealand, and you focus a lot on charter schools. Can you explain what they are and why you became interested in them, and also why they are important?
Yeah, I've long been interested in education. I think the most important investment that any country can make is an investment in human capital. That has large effects, not just for the productivity and the wealth, but also for the kind of society that you can have. If you have literate, thoughtful people, then you're probably going to have quite a nice place. If you don't, then things can be a bit ugly. So, first of all, I believe, as someone with very strong free market beliefs, that there is a case for taxpayers to fund education, and the reasons are that you imagine that you hadn't been born yet, you didn't know what sort of parents you were going to have, you didn't know what sort of academic abilities you were going to have. You would probably want to buy into an insurance scheme that made sure you got funding for your education. Now, of course, unborn people can't buy insurance, but what we essentially say is, for 5% of your earned income through your life, you will get a state-funded education. Where we need to improve is the way that education is provided. So the state can be the funder, but it needn't necessarily be the provider of education. So what we've done with partnership schools, which is what we call charter schools in New Zealand, is we have said that people with ideas about how to better run schools for disadvantaged kids can come forward, they can go through an application process, and if they're accepted, then they will receive state funding in return for getting results. So what we've done and what we are doing, we've opened 5 schools last year, 4 more opening this year, is that we are seeing people who might not otherwise be operating schools be able to come forward, use their ideas, and give kids an option they wouldn't have otherwise had.
It strikes me that there's a balancing act for charter schools between, on the one hand, independence of methodology, but also accountability towards the government and taxpayers. How do you balance that?
Yeah, so we say, look, there are 4 things we want. First is academic achievement. So we measure test scores. We want to see partnership schools doing as well as or better than comparable state schools. So we know they're adding value academically. Second is student engagement. So we want to see that students are actually showing up and attending the schools. Thirdly, financial probity. So we want to ensure that these schools are being run with the highest standards of financial transparency. That's very important. And finally, student safety. If the state is going to pay for and indeed require kids to be at a school, then the kids must be safe. So if you can do academic achievement, student engagement, financial probity and student safety, then the field is wide open for the types of methodologies that you use to engage the kids and get them good results.
Do you think that the charter school concept can be applied to higher education like colleges and universities, and what impact would that have, do you think?
Well, to an extent, we are applying it to colleges and universities. In New Zealand, at least, you can go to a university of your choice and you receive state funding that follows you. But the question is, how much stipulation is there around the internal running of the university? What sort of barriers are there to setting up a new one? So we've got the funding follows the student part right for universities. There's probably a bit much regulation around how they actually operate. So I think in most countries we actually do have kind of a charter model for tertiary education.
You're a fairly young reformer and also a liberal. What challenges has that brought to you?
Well, I'm the same age as many prominent New Zealand reformers were when they entered Parliament. So Sir Roger Douglas, Ruth Richardson, Richard Prebble were all my age or younger when they entered Parliament. The other thing I say to people is, look, the average age in New Zealand is about 35. I am 31. I'm one of very few politicians in New Zealand who is actually getting closer to the median age. Every other politician is getting further away. So I'm not too worried about age. It's really how hard you work. It's not who you are that really matters at the end of the day. It's what you do. Now, so far as being a liberal, you're always going to have challenges when you're trying to make government smaller, even though you're part of that institution. That is difficult. And of course, there's also certain dynamics in politics which favour larger government. So, for example, if you look at the situation we have with Uber, the sort of competitive taxi service right now, you've got a relatively small number of people who are lobbying very hard to prevent this system from coming to be. You have a relatively large number of people who are benefiting from using Uber. Now, of course, the problem is that even though there's more people benefiting, they care a little bit. The people who stand to lose the taxi industry, they care a lot. And so you have this classic concentrated benefits, dispersed costs problem. And the job of a liberal politician is always to represent those dispersed costs and ensure that those people actually get their representation and that the concentrated benefits don't win out.
New Zealand is a fairly prosperous country. So what challenges do you think that New Zealand is facing? What are you focusing on apart from schools?
Well, first of all, I mean, we are prosperous by current world standards. But you've got to remember that we were leading the world in women's rights in 1900. I don't think many people would be pleased if we'd stopped then. So there's always a lot more to do. One of the most important areas is the regulatory area. We've got to a stage where most people have a fairly good idea of what the role of government should be in ownership. So if you say to people, we think the government should own a pizza chain, most people would say, nah, that's stupid. We have a fairly good idea of what the government should and shouldn't spend on. If you say to people, the government should buy everybody pizza, most people would say, no, that's stupid. There's things the government has to do, but that's not one of them. Whereas if you say the government should regulate what type of pizza you should have, how much cheese should be on it, what sort of ingredients, what sort of packaging, what sort of labels, where the pizza shops can be located, people would say, oh yeah, that's all a great idea. And so we need to get to a stage where we have a culture of rational regulation, where regulation is a way of curing market failures and doing so only when the effect of the regulation is net positive, rather than what we have now, where people believe that regulation is just a way to impose your preferences on others. Classic example, hugely important for our generation, is housing or land use regulation. So you have an urban planning profession that is determined to make everybody live on top of each other in denser and denser dwellings. That's not the history of urban development in the natural run of things. Actually, what happens as people get wealthier and time goes on is that people actually seek more space. So these restrictions on the city growing out go counter to consumer demand. And of course, when the supply side doesn't give what the demand side wants, prices go up. And so we now have a situation due to bad regulation where housing is out of reach for a whole generation. Whether or not you afford a house is increasingly linked to whether or not your parents got into the property game and can support you to buy one. So for the first time in the history of New Zealand, which has always been a frontier country, the ownership of property is becoming hereditary. It's like almost a return to feudalism because of bad regulations. So we need to do better in education and social services. We could still do better with government expenditure and government ownership. There's always things we can improve, but the main area of focus, I believe, is that we need to do better with regulation.
You work a lot in Canada as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done there?
Yeah, so I worked for a couple of think tanks. I worked for the Frontier Centre, I worked for the Manning Foundation, and I worked on a whole range of things. I wrote a book called Birth of a Boom, Saskatchewan's Dawning Golden Age, which was all about what makes societies flourish and what Saskatchewan needed to flourish. And it was largely empowerment of the individual and a willingness to trade with outsiders. If you look at Enlightenment Scotland, the Islamic Golden Age, people forget, especially at the moment, there was a time when the Islamic world was highly enlightened and led the world in things like chemistry, built the world's first libraries and so on. Or even if you look at the Golden Age of ancient Athens, they all had individual empowerment and a willingness to trade across borders with other people that enriched them and made them prosperous. So that was a lot of my work at Frontier. At Manning we did a lot of stuff on municipal governance. Basically I think there's a debate, certainly in the Western world, about whether municipal governments are there to basically provide a basket of public goods that are not readily available on private markets. And by that I mean things like road networks, sewer networks, maybe some public transport networks, and some parks and club goods, or whether municipal government actually exists to be a sort of little city-state. And I think mayors are becoming more popular than prime ministers and presidents. We're seeing the re-emergence almost of a city-state, and that's coming at enormous expense, terrible duplication. And then of course municipal or local government is also in the regulation game, and some of the worst regulators. Where I'm from in Auckland, we're about to see a proposed ban on open fireplaces. For what? They haven't considered the loss of welfare to all those people who like having an open fire, all those older people who will be cold in the winter, and because allegedly particulates are damaging human health in Auckland, it doesn't seem that regulation has faced proper cost-benefit analysis. But it's funny how these things connect together. So things I was doing in Canada, plus échange, similar challenges back in New Zealand.
Thank you very much, David.
Oh, thank you.